Okay, welcome to the week 5 online lecture. I hope everyone is well. This will be a relatively short lecture, as I promised all the other ones would be, but hopefully it is definitely the case this time. So, going to do a little bit of investigating into social impact assessment. Now, we've looked at a number of different ways that social dimensions are considered in environmental impact assessment. And for those who had EIAs in class that we looked at that had a social investigation impact assessment element to them, you would have noticed how much detail can go into exploring, understanding, investigating how a community or a series of communities might be affected by a development proposal. So we just want to talk a little bit about what social impact assessment is, how it relates to environmental impact assessment, why, for example, you might see social impact assessments included in EIA, but also just to clarify that it can also be a standalone process and what possible benefits might it provide in assessing impacts to both people and environment. So also, you don't have to have watched and or listened to this prior to the Google Hangout workshop. So if you don't get a chance or you're rushing to listen to this right before class, don't worry, you can listen to it after. This is a continuation of what we're talking about, but it's not absolutely necessary given we're going to be talking mostly about your assessment task. But there are some things here that will possibly be of interest for including or considering for your assessment. All right, so briefly going to discuss what it is, how it's applied, its regulatory status, what's actually included in the process, and hopefully give you an opportunity to reflect on whether there's a social impact assessment dimension to the project that you are hoping to look at for your assessment task. Okay, so in relatively plain terms, a pretty standard definition of social impact assessment is the process of managing the social aspects of development. Now, what counts as the social aspects and how you define that is really going to come down to the wording of the assessment criteria. So for those who've looked at the Environmental Effects Act criteria that triggers, that determines whether an EIA is needed or not, you'll notice that there are some criteria related to social community dimensions, understanding the impact on communities, both now and into the future. So a bit of that systems thinking dimension there. So the wording of the particular criteria, depending on where we are in the world, is going to shape how we understand and interpret the idea of the social aspects of development. So in some cases, it might be exploring both the negative and the positive aspects of development. So not only how communities are negatively affected, but are there possibilities for community regeneration, social investment, these types of things around whatever development proposal we're talking about. Again, like EIA, it's been a developer-led process. The difference with the SIA, as we'll get into in a second, is it probably has more proactive potential as an assessment tool than EIA. EIA is very much focused around impacts, and we often think about environmental impacts as negative and assessing what the scope or scale of those negative impacts might be. But social impact assessment is really quite interesting and innovative in that it has been used in a very proactive way to say, well, we can separate it from environmental impacts and we can look purely at social impact assessment of a community separate to any type of development proposal. So we can use it outside of these legislatively bounded frames that we use EIA for. And that in the literature around SIA has been promoted as a really positive dimension. The ability to actually implement SIA as a positive, proactive assessment process that has been inconsistent, and it's really, in my view, it's a really underutilized tool. But to just get back to the legislative aspect, aside from having triggers within EIA that talk about social impact, there isn't a separate, as it stands at the moment, a separate ministerial process for social impact assessment. But what has ultimately occurred is that developers get consultants to write social impact assessments and include them in their environmental impact assessment. So it's kind of happening anyway because the developers are required to respond to those triggers about social impact in the EIA legislation. But I think it's relatively true to say that social impact assessment is very much lagging behind EIA, both in terms of implementation globally and also an understanding of its relevance. But things like social justice, social equity, those types of ideas that are gaining a little bit more momentum, I think, will help to levitate SIA in terms of importance and emphasis. So as I said just then, SIA has great potential on issues around social justice and environmental justice, and I think the more we start to take a holistic systems perspective and understanding that the social and the ecological are intimately intertwined, then I think social impact assessment will gain more and more prominence as a proactive tool for understanding the impacts on the community. Now, I think it's easy to get caught up with in the impact language here, and think about it in those negative terms, as I said before. But we can think proactively. Could SIA be the basis for a business's corporate social responsibility plan? So, you do social impact assessment, and it basically sets a framework for saying, well, this is the positive potential of our project, business, whatever, on the community, both now and into the future. And it could be a way of sort of setting out a social license to operate or a corporate social responsibility plan. But as I said, at present, it's very much caught up in the technical and very site-specific process of impact assessment in the same way that EIA is. So, in a sense, whilst social impact assessment has great potential to be used more strategically and proactively, it's very much caught at that impact scale. So it's a bit like saying, well, social impact assessment could be more strategic, more broad-ranging, more policy-based, more interestingly applied, in a similar way to saying EIA could be more focused on scale, both temporal and spatial, could be more policy-based if it was more like strategic environmental assessment. So there is some sort of parallel there in terms of thinking about social impact assessments, very applied technical implementation versus its strategic policy potential. So just as a couple of examples that I'm thinking about from cases I've read and seen and looked into with a little bit of detail, is that, say for example, you could use social impact assessment to draw attention to issues of gender inequity in development proposals. Now, I talked a little bit about a few weeks ago about a community implementation plan for a village displacement as a result of a dam project, where basically the public consultation just involved talking to men about what they wanted their new village to look like. Now, there would be potential with social impact assessment with good protocols and a really clear theoretical grounding to say, well, no, there's social equity and social justice dimensions to impact assessment that mean we have to consider the whole community. Who is the community? Who is made up? Who constitutes the people in this particular village? And that has the potential to shed light on issues of inequality around gender representation, but also race and class and those types of issues. I think another fantastic potential is the ability to open up opportunities for Indigenous knowledge to be factored in. So to say, well, there are other ways of knowing and understanding the world and how that world is affected by development proposals. Now, to be more focused on social impact assessment means being more sensitive to the way that different peoples understand and experience and relate to the world around them. So I think social impact assessment could open up more opportunities for those types of things. And is there a chance to bring in some deliberative democracy into decision making? So I think a natural extension of starting to think more deeply about social impact assessment is to say, well, who is making the decisions and how are they making them around determining what a social impact will be? So when you think about, okay, here's a report that looks at the social impact of some decision making around planning, for example, it's not a great leap to say, well, maybe the people who are to be affected should be involved in that decision-making process and in the deliberations around how we understand impact. Yeah, I think it's easier to make that connection and to justify the need for a more democratic process of impact assessment. And in a way, I think, like I sort of said before in slightly convoluted terms, it's a bit like the difference between EIA and SEA. There's potential to think about strategic social assessment in a way that isn't as bounded and limited as EIA is. All right, now that's pretty much it in terms of me talking to you, or in this case to the screen. But I want to give you a little bit of an example about what can go wrong when social impact assessment isn't necessarily done well. And actually, that's not entirely true. It's more of an example of saying, here's how it can be presented that you have done a comprehensive and thorough and equitable and just environmental assessment process. Yet, perhaps when you dig a little bit deeper, that impact assessment process hasn't necessarily considered the full scope of community and public sentiment. It's also an interesting way of looking at how consultants can present their work and the thoroughness and completeness and certainty of their findings, but that doesn't necessarily filter down to how the community understands risk and threat to landscape, to lifestyle, to livelihood. Okay, so I have put the slides under the slides tab on Blackboard, so you can just click on the links from those slides rather than having to type these out. So watch these in order. The first one is, as I said, from a developer, from a consultant's perspective, who have done a consultant's report, extensive report on the potential impact of fracking in the UK. And then the next story is from the BBC, looking at community perspectives on this development proposal. So have a look at those, but then come back. So you can pause now and then come back to some questions that I have for you. These are just general reflection questions to think about as a result of what you've seen here. So feel free to pause, watch the clips and come back. Okay, so having watched those, just a couple of things to think about is how effectively public participation in social impact assessment might have worked in this case. Now, it seems like a potentially self-evident question, but what what's resulted in this difference between the way that the project is being perceived and presented? Could strategic social impact assessment work in this case? And what role might social impact assessment have for screening and scoping an EIA for your assignment? So, what I want you to think a little bit about, what are the communities that will be affected by your proposal? And I want you to think in a strategic way. I don't want you to necessarily just be too bounded by the site of the development proposal. What impact, for example, would your development proposal have on a future generation? Now, if we think in the way that some Indigenous communities do, in terms of 7 generations, of understanding what the impact would be in 7 generations' time of a particular decision or impact, what impacts, constraints, opportunities, challenges does your project set up for future generations? In 2 generations' time or 3 generations' time, will they be left with cleaning up the mess from your proposal, assuming it has a significant environmental impact? They're some of the questions I want you to think about. And so, just to finish off, if you are interested, I would encourage you to do a quick Google search on the Quadrilla fracking proposal, because that has concluded, well, it hasn't entirely concluded, but a decision has now been made on whether that is to go ahead or not. And it has been a really, really interesting process for looking at the deliberative democratic potential of EIA and SIA, for understanding how local decision making can be in opposition to and representative of community concerns. So it's just a really, really interesting example. I will, once I get back, I'll put up a few links on Blackboard for those who didn't get a chance to track any down, and I will mention that project as well. But if you are interested, a quick Google will bring up a couple of stories. The BBC ones are pretty good. There's a few videos in there of subsequent reports. I won't give it all away, but very, very interesting. All right, that's me done. All going well here. Had a really good, having a really good time at the conference, and I look forward to seeing you and or writing to you on the Google Hangout in a day or two. Now, I'm hoping this will go up before then. A little bit of a dodgy internet situation at the moment, but we'll see. It doesn't matter if it doesn't, because, as I said, not entirely related to our Google Hangout session. So I hope all is well, and I'll see you next week. All right, bye.